think a lot of guys buy into this happy wife, happy life. And I'll tell you, your wife doesn't even want that. That's way too much even pressure for her. She's like, so I got to be happy all the time in order for you to feel okay.
Yep.
Like, and they don't say that out loud, but that's what they feel. So like, if the wife isn't happy and the guy's trying to do everything in his power to make her happy, that's actually sometimes quite repulsive to women, right?
Welcome back to the Present Fathers Podcast. Today our guest is Larry Hagner. Larry is a husband, father of 4 boys, got a whole fire team there. He's also the founder of the Dad Edge and the Dad Edge podcast. And so, Larry, we're absolutely thrilled to have you on our show. Welcome to the Present Fathers Podcast. How are you, brother?
Oh, was I supposed to be present? I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. Yeah, no, it's great to meet you
Dad
guys.
joke right up front. There we go. We're off to the races now.
Right. No, man, I'm honored to be here. It's really, really cool what you guys are doing here with this podcast and obviously with your coaching group too. And yeah, I'm excited to be here, man.
We're pumped, man. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Dad Edge and kind of the background of it? You know, I know that, you know, growing up, you didn't exactly have a great father figure in your life. And so just walk us through that and really why you got started and how.
Yeah, you know, I think the Dad Edge probably got started when I was younger. When I was a kid, it probably really kind of got started when I was a kid because I wanted a present, you know, father figure in the house. I didn't have that growing up. I did have an amazing grandfather though that I spent a ton of time with, and he only lived a mile away from us. So, and he would, you know, when I was in elementary school, he'd pick me up every day after school, and so like I got to spend a lot of time with him, and he was a very good man. But as far as like a immediate father, you know, my journey is kind of interesting, I guess. I mean, there's always an interesting story, but this one it's probably kind of unique. But you know, my mom and biological father got married pretty young. They got married when they were about 21, and I think they got married in like 71. So it was pretty quick and pretty young to get married. And then they had me 4 years later in 75. And then after I was born, they went through a pretty horrific divorce. And my dad like left, and I have no recollection of him. He did visit me when I was little, and you know, took me on weekends. I don't remember any of it. In fact, and he was completely out of my life from what I remember by the time I was like 4. So I have no recollection of my biological father. And I literally remember being in preschool, and I remember dads coming to pick up their kids from school. So like some dads would be in a suit, some dads would be like in jeans, so I always knew like, oh, I wonder what that dad does or that dad. So I knew about dads. I knew we didn't have one. It didn't really bother me though. Like as a kid, like I just figured at that point, like moms go out and find dads. Like that was literally my interpretation. Like kids magically appear and moms eventually find a dad. And my mom hadn't found a dad yet for our family. So, you know, when I was 4, same year, I'll never forget this. My mom came up to me one day. I think it was a Friday night, and she's like, "Hey, I'm having a friend over for dinner tonight. I work with him, and he's a very special friend, and he's been a friend of mine for a little bit, and I really want you to meet him." That was her way of saying, "I'm dating someone at work, and it's time for you to meet him. We've reached that point." So, like, I'll never forget this guy walking in our house. Like, I'll never forget it. Like, I still remember it vividly to this day. Like, this man walks in our house. It's the evening time. It's cold outside. He's wearing a trench coat. He's wearing a 3-piece suit, like a double Windsor tie. I still remember like the color of the tie. It was like red with white polka dots. And he had this blue suit on, and he had this mustache and like feathered hair and looked really professional, had a briefcase. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that's a dad. Like I've seen dads pick up my buddies at school. That's a dad. So like I literally went up to, like, my mom introduced me. I shook his hand, and like the first question that pops out of my mouth at 4 years old, I'm like looking up at this guy beaming, and I just said, "Are you going to be my dad?" And my mom, like I still remember, I think my mom kind of gasped. She was like, like, and then, but lo and behold, I think my mom kind of took that as a sign, and like 6 months later they got married, and I was in the wedding and the whole 9 yards, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Like my family's complete. And they were together for 6 years. They were together till I was 10. And I'll tell you, every year that they were together, it just got progressively worse and worse and worse and worse. And he was a heavy drinker. So was my mom. He was very heavy-handed. He would hit me. He'd hit my mom. My mom and him would get in physical fights. I mean, cops were called to my house. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, but I kind of grew up in that. I mean, I'm going to be 50 this year. I kind of grew up in this generation where if you mouthed off, you got hit. Like, and there was nothing wrong with that back then. So getting spanked or hit or slapped or whatever, whatever, that happened all the time. But I mean, I would say ours was a bit excessive, especially when he would hit my mom. But anyway, they got divorced when I was 10, and I've never seen the guy since. And I remember being 10, and I was like, man, like, this really sucks. Because you're kind of in 4th or 5th grade, and all your buddies have their dads, and you're like, I don't have a dad. My dad left. And when you're that age, in that generation, like, oh, your house is just a mess. Like, you're just a mess, right? So I started asking a lot of questions, because at that point in my life, I knew that man was not my biological dad. And I knew what the birds and the bees were. So I started asking a lot of questions. And my mom told me, she was like, yeah, actually, you've got another dad out there. I was married before. I'm like, I had no idea. I was like, what? She's like, yeah, I was married for like 4 years to your dad. And I was like, no way. I was like, what is this guy like? Where's he at? Why don't we see him? Like, my mom's like, I don't know. I don't know where he's at. I don't know. And that was really it. A couple years go by. I won't get into it for time's sake, but I met my father, my biological father. It was a total fluke, total accident. He lived 3 miles from us. I knew his name, and that's all I knew. And serendipitously, we met. And he was remarried at the time, had a 2-year-old son, another one on the way. And I was like, man, I was over the moon. I was like, this is like my dad. I immediately started calling this guy dad. I saw him every week. He came to my Little League games. He hung out with me. I hung out at his house with his wife and my half brother, and it was awesome. And then like 6 months into this relationship, I just noticed like he was kind of like, I felt like he was under pressure or under duress. He was just kind of colder, a little distant, not anything crazy, but just sort of like distant. And I remember being 12, and I called him up one day, and I just basically asked him about it. I was like, hey, what's going on? Like, I just get this feeling like something's wrong. Like, or maybe I did something wrong. Guys, I don't even remember what I said. I don't remember what he said. All I know is that conversation was the end of our relationship. So he left again. And I was like, whew, that sucks. And I went into a bit of a depression. I'm not going to lie, when I was a little kid. Like a lot of my friends, like, you're kind of like the joke after like stuff like that happens, and everybody knows what your house is like. And I kind of gave up, to be honest. Like, I overate, became pretty fat kid. I failed the 8th grade. I actually do 8th grade twice. Turned the ship around though, went on to high school, went on to college, met my wife in college, got a degree, got into medical device sales. But my entire like 18 years of upbringing was just this revolving door of guys just coming in and out of my life. Like, my mom would always date people. She was married 3 times by the time I was 18. Every guy was the same guy. Every guy was the same guy. Just toxic, partier, drinker, hit you, yell at you, a total mess. So fast forward until I'm 30. Okay. And this is kind of where the story starts and begins. And so I'm sitting in a coffee shop with my sales team. And at the time I was doing medical device sales. So I was in the OR a lot. I had a standing Monday morning meeting at a Starbucks here in St. Louis. I'm married for 2 years at this point. I had a son on the way, my very first son on the way. And I'm sitting there at this meeting, and I look up, and this guy kind of catches my eye who comes in, and I'm like, holy crap, like, that's my father. My dad walked in to get his morning coffee. I hadn't seen him since I was 12. And I was like, would you look at that? And one of the people on my team, she knew my story, and we were friends outside of work. So her husband and her and me and my wife, we would go out on double dates a lot. So we kind of had this friendship. So she kind of knew my story. And when she saw this look on my face, I was trying not to make it really well known, but she's like, are you okay? Like, you look like you're just seeing a ghost. I was like, you're not going to believe this. I was like, my dad just walked in here. And she's like, I'm sorry, what? And I'm like, my dad just walked in here. He's right over there. She's like, no way. Are you talking about the guy you haven't seen since you were 12? I'm like, yeah. And she's like, oh my God. Like, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? And I was like, nothing. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to go up to him. It's be weird. I was like, I'm 30 years old. Like, there's nothing to say. Well, she took it upon herself to just walk over and go sit at his table. And all of a sudden they're like having a conversation. And I'm like, what is she doing? What are they saying? And then all of a sudden I saw my dad look over at me. We locked eyes and I'm like, oh my God, like what is about to happen? And he just like stood up very humbly. I make him sound like a bum. He's not. He's a very successful entrepreneur. Still married to the same woman after 45 years. I have 2 younger half brothers. But he walks over, extends his hand. He's like, man, he's like, hey, like, how are you? And I'm like, I'm fine. How are you? Like, I wasn't nice, but I wasn't a jerk. I was kind of like just indifferent. Well, that serendipitous moment has now turned into a 20-year relationship. And we're friends. You know, I wouldn't say we're father-son, but we're friends. And we share time together, and I see him often and all that. But like, I would tell you that I was a dad for 6 years before I started Dad Edge. So my oldest was 6. My youngest at the time was 4. And I swore to myself, you know, when I get married, I know what a terrible upbringing is like, and I'm going to be a good dad. And I'm never going to hit my kids out of anger, and I'm never going to be a bad husband. I'm going to make sure my marriage is on point. And what I'll tell you is I broke all 3 of those promises to myself. All 3. And the serendipitous moment happened when I unfortunately spanked my 4-year-old. Not proud of that. In fact, the image is like literally burned in my mind, and I don't know if I'll ever get rid of it. But he stepped out of line one night, and I spanked him. It was the first and last time I've spanked him. Unfortunately, I spanked him hard. It was a very reactionary moment. Spanked him on the rear end, and he fell. And I was like, oh my God, what did I just do? So I went to go pick him up, and he kind of like turned over, and he saw me like coming at him like this with my hands out, like, oh my God, are you okay? And he literally just did this. Like he squinched his eyes, and he's like literally put his hands up, like, please don't hurt me. And I was just like, oh my God, what have I done? And that was 17 years ago. I'm sorry, that was 13 years ago. And that's never happened since. But that was the catalyst to launching what is now Dad Edge, which was never supposed to be what it is. It was just supposed to be it was like a therapeutic thing for me to learn. And so I started a blog and I started a podcast, never for a following. I just did it for myself and never expected it to go really anywhere. And here we are a decade later and still podcasting and still talking about this stuff and still learning. But if I'm being really honest, it's saved my marriage. I've got 4 boys. I'm close to all of them. Thank God for that. I will tell you, it's also saved my life. I would not be walking on this planet right now if it wasn't for this mission. So yeah, there it is.
Well, hey man, that's beautiful. Go ahead, Brandon.
I was going to say thank you first off for your courageous transparency in all of this. And I agree, it's a journey, and there are things that as a dad you do that make you feel guilty and shameful, and they spark something in you. And so for us, you know, it's been we created the podcast ourselves in a very similar manner. And I can tell you, we have grown so tremendously. So I guess my first question to you is just kind of like your evolution. Like, how has your understanding of like fatherhood evolved since you started the Dad Edge? You know, like what's the biggest lesson you've learned as, you know, a podcaster and being a dad, right?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I feel like I've been doing this now for 10 years, and I always feel like I'm just scratching the surface. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that when you have, I had this conversation with my 18-year-old. And so he and I were in Kansas City this past weekend, and I went there for a wrestling tournament for him.
Nice.
And then we ended up spending the next 2 days just in Kansas City, just with one-on-one time. And on the way home, the 3-hour trip home, we played Ask Me Anything, right? Which is I ask him anything, he asked me anything. And we had this conversation, and the conversation was, he's like, you've been doing like the dad stuff for like 10 years. He's like, I would say you're an expert. And I just like laughed, and I said, Ethan, I'm not an expert in this. I was like, I'm still learning. And as soon as I let my foot off the gas, I stopped learning. Like I'm in trouble. Right. And I told him, I was like, think of it this way. I was like, do you remember your first day of freshman year of high school? He's like, yeah. I was like, do you remember your first year of junior high? He's like, yeah. I was like, what about kindergarten? He's like, I totally do. I was like, yeah. I was like, today, as it stands, I'm raising an 18-year-old who is 10 months and 3 days old. And this is my first day raising an 18-year-old who's 10 months and 3 days old. I was like, and tomorrow will be my first day of raising an 18-year-old who's 10 months and 4 days old. I I was like, so every day is new. And as soon as I think I have my arms wrapped around the current state, season, or stage, something different happens. And I need to learn something different. I was like, so I don't feel like I've ever learned, but I will tell you this. Being a father, it's a very human thing. In other words, we're going to make mistakes. It's going to be messy. It's going to break your heart. And the wins are going to feel like the most wonderful things on the planet and everything in between. But we don't view it that way, as in, I can't make a mistake. I can't be human about this. I have to execute it perfectly, right? And a lot of guys feel that way because fatherhood to them is a very intimate thing that's insanely important to them, but also kicks their ass every single day. And I just hope that the things that we're talking about on the podcast, the things that we teach, that butt kicking doesn't feel nearly as harsh. And you also are very aware when the next one might be coming, and you can probably do something about it to get out of your own way.
We interrupt this episode to talk about Synthesis Tutor, the world's first superhuman math tutor. It is warm, patient, and understanding, and adapts to your child so you never have to worry about them falling behind when it comes to math. In episode 84, we spoke to Chrisman Frank, the CEO of Synthesis, and immediately afterwards, I purchased Synthesis Tutor for my daughter, and it has been an absolute game changer for us. Math used to be a very painful experience. It was frustrating, and there was lots of tears for my daughter when it came to learning math. It's something she's not naturally good at, and we struggled a lot. Now she happily uses Synthesis Tutor every single week, and there's no more frustrating nights. The way it works is that it leverages AI to adapt the experience to your child to not simply master memorization of math facts, but it actually teaches the principles and concepts so that your child can independently solve problems without needing tons of outside help. Because it tailors the experience to your child, it is always adapting and learning where the child is in terms of their development, and it keeps them in the proximal zone of learning so that your child is being challenged but not getting frustrated or defeated by the experience. I am very pleased with our experience on Synthesis Tutor. My daughter's grades have improved in math. It's something that I can now outsource. I don't have to take the time myself to sit there and try and memorize facts with her. She gets excited to do it, and it's fun and engaging for her to learn instead of this frustrating experience, and it doesn't feel like a chore any longer. So we at the Present Fathers Podcast highly endorse Synthesis Tutor. There is also a Teams function for those with multiple kids or maybe multiple families want to pool their children together. You can check that out on the website. You can get 10% off with your purchase by going to synthesis.com/PFP. That's synthesis.com/PFP. Go there, check it out, and start supercharging your child's learning experience with the power of AI. Back to the episode. Yeah, that's so good. And you highlight such a few really critical things that all men need to understand, even if they're not a dad. But just growth as a man in general, which obviously growing as a man translates to being a better husband and father too. So, it's not like they're these separate things, which is kind of I think the first misassumption a lot of guys have is that they're not interconnected. But the fact that you stepped up to start something focused on just a little bit of improvement every day, and then as it naturally grew, you had increased responsibility and vision for this that now other people are relying on you for. And that's kind of one of the secrets of growth as a man is having something of purpose, right? It may not be your whole life. You may not quit your job for it, but just having something that you really care about that's meaningful forces you to step up, right? And without some of that positive pressure, it's really hard for any man to just be like the guy all the time without a little bit of an outside force to make you the guy, And then I think the other principle that's really true with what you told your son is that I think we fall into this trap that's like, I'm going to do this massive feat of whatever, right? I'm going to read all the books, or I'm going to get super fit, or I'll do all these things, and then I'll be a good guy, right? And in reality, it's just tons of little things every single day for a long period of time. And you're right, you never really arrive. There's no actual finish line in that sense. It's more of you kind of hit these break points where you have more capacity to take on bigger and better things and make a bigger impact. But you're right back to square one. You got to learn the new thing and continue to improve. And I think the other thing you were alluding to is obviously with the Dad Edge, you're connected now with tons of men who are also just trying to get a little bit better. And that is such a powerful force. It's such a masculine thing that I think we've lost, where you just naturally have to learn different perspectives and skills and techniques, and even share in the losses together, not just the wins of like, hey man, I'm really struggling with my kids. I don't know what to do here. And maybe they don't even have an answer for you, but just knowing that they understand you too, like you said, it saved your life. I agree. I mean, that is a very healing thing for men. And so I just love that you really highlighted that, because this isn't like a podcaster exclusive thing, or this isn't a Dad Edge exclusive thing. This is men in general. So to any guy listening, I hope you really extract that from Larry's story here, that, you know, regardless of your background, the best way to start stepping forward and growing is engaging in something that's a little bit bigger than yourself and involving other men in that process. And whatever that looks like, it will absolutely pay dividends in your life.
I agree, man. And I'll tell you, a lot of experts that I've had even on my show will tell you that community is literally the game changer for men, but it has to be the right men, the right community, because if it's not, you could go the other direction. Right. And you know, no one, you know, I tell this to my boys all the time. I'm like, if you hang out with, like, so my 17-year-old plays football. My oldest is a wrestler. I was like, if you hang out with football players that have the same vision you do, in other words, I'm going to go kick my ass in the gym. I'm going to put on as much size and strength as I possibly can. I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to do drugs. I'm going to eat right, because this is what I am. This is my direction. This is where I'm going. And if you hang out with people who are doing drugs, who are drinking, who are flunking out of school, eventually you're going to be one of them. Right. So when it comes to us as men, that circle of friends is the exact same thing. And I actually think it's our responsibility as dads that one of the most powerful things that we can do is show our kids, like my son on this 3.5 hour trip, he brought up a friend of his that is into really, he's reckless, absolutely reckless. Like, this kid, you know, goes 120 miles an hour on the highway, smokes weed all the time, dropped out of wrestling, you know, and he desperately wants to be friends with my son. And he's like, what do I do about that? And I was like, well, first of all, I was like, do you see me hanging out with people like that? Do you see me hanging out with knuckleheads? He's like, no. I was like, that's because there are certain relationships that you have to keep out here. Like, I don't want any part of that. Like, I'll be nice to you. Like, if that's your life, that's your life. If that's what makes you happy, great. I'm not, you're not my people. On the flip side, I want to be around men who have a mission. I want to be around guys who have a vision. I want to be around guys who want to grow and be more and do more and all of these different things, right? And I'm not going to get that by hanging out with the dudes that I went to college with and got drunk with every weekend, right? Now, I will say this. Those guys are still a lot of fun. You know, and I'll hang out with them like 3 times a year, but they're not like my go-to, my ride or die tribe, right? That's dangerous in my world. Like, that's not the direction I'm headed. And if I hang out with people like that, that is the direction we're going to head, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's like if you hang out with 5 smokers, you'll be the 6th. If you hang out with 5 gym goers, you'll be the 6th. You know, it's human nature to kind of conform to your circle, whatever that circle is. And what I've found to be the only way for a man to ensure that he has the actual, like, kind of strength of character to hold those boundaries, you know, because in a lot of ways our modern culture has convinced men that if you dare hold a boundary, you're toxic, right? And that's kind of insane, and that would be a whole separate episode if we broke that down. But the only way to really define it is for yourself internally, right? And so the number one way is you have to define that long-term vision, like you said. What are you actually working towards? That's your destination. And if you can't even describe that for yourself, then how on earth are you going to decide today of like, nope, that thing doesn't get me closer to the vision for my family or for me, my legacy, right? That kind of end state destination has to be clear to you, at least in some of the core elements, right? Obviously, life's going to happen and there's going to be tons of twists and turns throughout that journey. But having that defined end state is where you can then kind of in the day to day decide for yourself, no, I don't need this and I don't need that, and that guy's bad for me, and whatever. And then you have to define your personal values. And if you're unwilling to do those things for yourself, then how on earth are you going to hold a boundary? Because boundaries are just a reflection of kind of that inner presence, really. And that's the thing I just want to encourage all the men out there is holding a boundary does not make you a hateful or judgmental person. And in fact, judgment is a word that's been kind of co-opted as well. There's a difference between judging someone and condemning them, right? So judging is I'm assessing your character, I'm assessing what you're bringing to the table or what your lifestyle is like, and then I'm going to decide whether or not I want to allow that into my space. I'm not going to go preach at you and manipulate you or whatever, or condemn you, but I'm also going to hold a healthy boundary of like, hey man, I know you like to do that kind of stuff, but I don't do that, and we just need to go our separate ways or whatever. And that's what men need to do. And unfortunately, I've seen in my experience, a lot of men are so afraid of holding basic boundaries with just day-to-day people, not even like close relationships. And it's really harming more than just themselves. It's their families, right? Because if you can't even hold a boundary for yourself, how are you going to flex that kind of wall on things that should be kept away from your family or influences from your family and your children and things like that? So just wanted to kind of like highlight that. And I love the way you walked through that, because it's a very important element. Whether you're a teenage boy or a grown man, you've got to really kind of cultivate that right circle for yourself, because it will really determine your long-term success, however you define success. I know Brandon has a question for you too now, so I'll pass it over to him.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so important to have the right people in our circle. And I think for our children, one of the most important people we have to have in that circle is the dad, right? They have to have their father present there, having the finger on the pulse, knowing what their kid's life is and where their kid wants to go with it, so they can help guide them, right? And have core principles that you teach them, so that way they can create their own vision of their own life, right? Because I always say that whatever we don't teach our children, the world is going to brutally teach them later. And that's my job and my responsibility is to protect that. And so core principles are really important, and I talk about them a lot with my son and even with my daughter. So my question to you is, if you could narrow down like your teachings to 3 core principles of good fatherhood, what would they be and why?
Whew. That's a big question. So ours is obviously personal to us, but ours is, first of all, are you talking about fatherhood core principles or just how our family operates?
Yeah, well, just core principles that you teach, in the dad edge or to your kid, right? I mean, just anything that you apply that you feel is like at the heart of what a man should be.
Yeah. So, with us, number one is our faith. Like that's a foundational thing for us. And I always tell my kids, I'm like, hey, I'm your earthly father, but you have a heavenly father, right? And my job is to help you get to know him really well, right? So we pursue our faith relentlessly. Kind of interesting conversation I just had with my 11-year-old. So like I always try to like stair step the faith type of conversations to where they can understand them. And my 2 older boys very much into their faith. My 11 and 9-year-old, they're kind of like, they understand some of it, but I had a conversation with my 11-year-old. I always like to ask really deep questions with my kids, and I was sitting with him and I was sitting on the side of his bed as he's laying down one night, and this is just a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him, I said, what's your biggest fear? And I thought he was going to say like skydiving or something like that, right? And he goes, and without even hesitating, he said, my biggest fear is I die, I go to heaven, and God tells me I have to go to hell. And I'm like, are you serious? And he's like, yeah. I was like, just out of curiosity, like, why do you feel that way? He's like, I don't know. He's like, I just don't know if what I'm doing is the right thing. And I was like, oh, okay. So I was like, what if we had better conversations? Like, it's time. Like, it's definitely time for you and I to really help you explore this relationship with God. I was like, what if we start doing that? And he's like, yeah. So, and we're doing that now. So, which is great. We're watching The Chosen together. We have conversations around it. I bought him what's called the Epic Bible, which is kind of like a graphic novel of the Bible, but it's really digestible for them. And so that's number one, is faith. Number two is connection, deep human connection with our family. So we are not we do not have surface level relationships in this family. And we also have we also have a desire to formulate other connections with other people in our lives like that, friends and other relatives and that kind of thing. But the deep human connection is, hey, we're not going to go on autopilot. Like, we're not going to be a family that just is sitting on the couch next to each other in each other's space on devices. We're going to have conversations. We're going to have laughter. We're going to make this house and this family a place where you want to be, not feel like you have to be. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of things I do wrong as a dad and a lot of mistakes I've made, but that one, I think we've done really, really well, because what I've noticed is now that, and I feel like we have to pinch ourselves sometimes. And again, my life is not sunshine and rainbows. I'm not trying to paint this like perfect picture, because it's not. It's like every day there's bad moments, of course. But like at the end of the day, like the one thing that's really cool about our kids and our house is they actually want to be here. So much so that they not just want to be here and in their rooms with the door closed, but they're actually upstairs on the couch with us. And my 18-year-old came home from wrestling practice the other night, and he just like came and sat on the couch with us. And I looked at him, I go, I get the feeling you just really like being at home. And he looks at me, he goes, and without hesitating, goes, I love being at home. He's like, it's so comfortable here. He's like, it's like a place where no matter what's going on, like I can be here. And I was just like for me to hear that, I'm like, man, I guess we're doing like a couple of things right. If my 17-year-old is the exact same way. He's more of a homebody than my 18-year-old is. So I'm just like, man, like look at that. Like, so deep human connection within our family is something that is really, really important to us. Another one is this: experiences and doing life together over possessions. And I know I'm not really hitting characteristic things, but like things that are really important and meaningful in our family that helps us keep a bond super tight. And what does that look like? That looks like, well, you know what? We don't have nice cars in this family. We really don't. Like, we could go out and buy some nice cars. I don't want to buy a nice car because we have 4 boys that tear them up, right? The other thing too is you probably won't find any of us wearing designer clothes, designer shoes, but you will see us, putting resources towards experiences like, let's go on a cool vacation together. I'm not talking about like anything crazy like, oh, we're going to do like a 21-day trip to Europe. I'm not talking about that, but I am talking about like, let's go experience life together. And adventure is a big one in our family. So we can do life together as an adventure. So that's another big one. As far as like raising boys though, like that, because that's obviously a sweet spot for me.
Sure.
Here's some things that I'll tell you. My boys, we have conversations a lot about the women in our lives. So my 2 older ones have girlfriends, obviously my wife. And so we have a lot of conversations around like, hey, you treat a woman with respect. Oh, and I teach my boys, the women in your life need to feel seen, heard, and safe. Those are the 3 needs. And you need to feel respected, appreciated, and you need physical affection. Those are your 3 needs, right? But here, like, so I teach these boys this delicate dance of like, hey, make her feel seen, make her feel heard, make her feel safe, do nice things for her, love her unconditionally, and do not ever become a doormat for a woman. Ever. Do not tolerate disrespect. Do not tolerate emasculization. And the cool thing about my wife is she really takes the ownership of, like I take the ownership of, I need to show these boys how to love a woman, so I'm going to do that by loving you. My wife will tell you, I have a responsibility as well. I need to treat you with love, respect, appreciation, never disrespect, never emasculation, because I am responsible, my wife will say this, for setting the standard of how boys need to be treated.
That's right.
Right. And she's like, and these joker girls are going to come in and they're going to try to disrespect you. They're going to try to walk all over you. They're trying to emasculate you. No. You do not put up with that. Right. So that's another one. So operating with obviously character, integrity, leadership is another one. And here's the final thing I'll say. Dare, I love quotes, dare to be a stallion among the donkeys. Dare to be a stallion among the donkeys. And what does that mean? That means dare to be common, but yet do uncommon things. Dare to be uncommon, right? Because there's a lot of knuckleheads out there. There's a lot of people your age that are doing really stupid stuff. And if you're part of them, you're probably either one of the sheep or one of the donkeys. But a stallion or a lion, whatever you want to, compare it to, they lead a very different life, and they live life very differently, and dare to live that life and not this.
For sure.
Does that answer your question?
That's good stuff, man.
It does. Thank you. That was
I'm
beautiful.
getting fired up over here.
A bunch of extras there too.
Yeah, so
nice.
I know at the Dad Edge, you definitely hone in on marriage heavily, and obviously, there's a lot of stats out there showing that, the average marriage is not doing too good. I say that all the time. I definitely don't want average, because average kind of sucks. And obviously, you're training your teenage boys well, which most men did not get, right? I definitely did not have any conversations when I was a teenager about that dance, that dynamic. Maybe a little, but nowhere near to the level it needed to be. So what are some of the things that you've, found that most men today are struggling with when it comes to kind of demanding that respect and kind of being the guy who can earn that respect, and really where to start doing that? Because I know there's probably a lot of guys listening who are like, dang, well, that sounds good, but I don't even know how to get started on that. What have you seen be common starting points for most guys to kind of work on and recognize?
I think a lot of guys buy into this happy wife, happy life. And I'll tell you, your wife doesn't even want that. That's way too much even pressure for her. She's like, so I got to be happy all the time in order for you to feel okay.
Yep.
Like, and they don't say that out loud, but that's what they feel. So like, if the wife isn't happy and the guy's trying to do everything in his power to make her happy, that's actually sometimes quite repulsive to women, right? But yeah, marriage, like when I start to so I coach not only men, but I also coach couples. And when I ask a couple, I just took on a brand new couple, two people yesterday. They're now going to be they're not going to be clients. But I asked the wife, I was like, "What do you think his 3 needs are?" And I asked this of all my clients and of all people that come just do life with us. Like, what do you think your wife's needs are? And you'll see guys start to think, and if they listen to the podcast, they're like, "Oh, it's seen, heard, and safe. I heard it on the podcast." But otherwise, they're like, to be loved, cherished, and they need security. Right. But they really don't know. It's actually seen, heard, and safe, but they really don't even know how to execute that. And a lot of times too, they'll think of safety as like, well, she knows I'm not going to hurt her. I'm like, no. I was like, the safety aspect goes like, it has many, many branches, and it goes very far and very wide and very deep on several different. She needs to feel financially safe. She needs to feel intimacy safety. She needs parental safety. In other words, like, are you the guy who's going to be trigger happy with the kids and your patients, or can you be calm and resilient with the kids? Like, this safety thing infiltrates every part of her being, right? So even men knowing that, they're like, okay, now I kind of got that. But even women are just like, he needs sex. Like, no, that's not it. Actually, what he needs is appreciation, respect, and yes, he does need physical affection, but it's not the physical release that a man needs. It's the connection aspect that goes with it.
Yeah, it's like knowing. It's feeling her desire kind of without it being spoken, right?
Yeah.
It's that spiritual connection that really forms from when a husband and wife are actually kind of, the polarity between them is fully, coming to the surface. But yeah, that's, I think a lot of people, that's a big one for sure, that a lot of people like, pity sex or whatever. Oh, well, I'll just give it to him then. It's like, that almost feels worse because he knows you're not into it, right? And
exactly,
that's a dying marriage there. That's not a thriving one.
It is. And here's the funny thing too, is like my wife, so I'll be really open. My wife, I shot my wife a text message yesterday during the day, and I'm like, it was basically like, hey, our code word is I miss you. Right. And I'm like, hey, I miss you. And she's like, oh, well, and anyway, she kind of bounced around it, and we didn't, and I got the feeling, I was like, okay, well, she's not into it. And then I left my office, and she's sitting at the table. She's like, are you ready? And I'm like, ready for what? And she's like, aren't we going to have sex? And I'm like, I'm looking at the text. I'm like, I'm sorry, but this text message has nothing in here that you were even remotely interested in having sex. She's like, I didn't? I was like, no. And I read it back to her. She's like, oh my God, I guess I really didn't, did I? I was like, no. And then I actually had to leave anyway. So, but I think a lot of times, I want to get to this whole stereotypical sex thing, because like, I think a lot of women out there think that guys want sex in the relationship because they want that physical thing. And I want to clear, and I think a lot of guys have kind of even sort of bought into that. Well, I'm a dude, so this is what I need. And if you really, really talk to, you guys know this, I don't have to tell you this, but like, if you really, really talk to a man of like, why is it you want sex? Like you get to the physical part of it is minimal. It's the connection. It's the love. It's like, it's everything, right? Like that goes along with it. Oh, and it's cool that I get this physical release too, but it's all the other stuff. But here's where I think we can be bold, right? And we can, I think a lot of guys out there think that they have to be like this nice guy. In other words, I have to agree with everything she says. I can't ever push back. I can't make this is another one, by the way, is repulsive for women. I can't make decisions. She needs to make all the decisions because if she's making the decisions, she's happy. No, it's actually the opposite. If you're not making any decisions, you don't have a happy wife. That's for sure. But this whole thing with like this misalignment, and I've been married for 22 years and we've got a great relationship and a great sex life. But like, what was it, 2 days ago or whatever, I told her, I was like, hey, I miss you, which is like, hey, I want you, right? And she looked at me and she goes, you're so horny. Like you just had me 2 days ago. And I just looked at her and I was like, damn, like, right. And I just kind of brushed it off. I didn't say much about it. And then later that night I was like, hey, I want to address something with you. I just want to make sure that there's a mutual understanding here. When I said to you earlier that I missed you and you shot back and you're like, you're so horny. You had me 2 days ago. I was like, I just want to put this in your world for a second. You saying that is like you coming up to me and be like, I miss talking to you. I haven't talked to you. And I look at you and be like, I just talked to you yesterday. Why do you need to talk to me? Like, why do you need me to listen? I just listened to you yesterday. And then you saw it on my wife's face, like, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. I was like, yeah. I was like, but I think we can lovingly and respectfully, like she knew I wasn't picking a fight with her because I just very lovingly, I was like, I need to address something with you. Yeah. And here it is. And the way that she took that is like, there was so much respect and credibility. She was like, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. I'm like, yeah. So like, I think if we buy into this, as long as she's happy, she's making all the decisions, and then I'll find my happiness somewhere. I think that is so dangerous for married couples.
Well, it's dangerous to the man on his own because you never speak up for yourself. You lose all your own self-respect. So of course she's not going to respect you. I want to address the decision one real quick. I've got a fun little test that guys can use to see if they're actually doing a good job at that one. And then I'll kick it over to Brandon because he's actually our marriage expert in my program. But I call it the shopping cart test, but you can insert this for like any menial, mundane, little, not serious situation. But the example is like, my wife and I go to the grocery store often together just because we can, and it's a fun little thing to do every now and then. And I caught myself years ago recognizing that every time we'd walk in, we're going to buy groceries for like 2 weeks, right? And I would turn to her and go, honey, do we need a shopping cart? Like I'm asking her to decide whether or not we need a cart. And I'm like, I had this epiphany that I've been an army commander. I've led troops in battle, and then I'm deferring to my wife over a shopping cart. And like, she doesn't care. She just wants me to grab the dang cart so she doesn't have to decide anything, And so that example, like I said, insert any situation. But if you're constantly deferring little decisions that aren't actually important at all, and she's absolutely not going to care whatever you decide just because it's one less decision she has to make, what message are you sending to your wife, right? If it's an isolated incident, oh well, no big deal, right? But if that's 300 times a week, then her impression of you is, this is a little boy I have to take care of. This isn't my husband that I sexually desire, right? Now, this isn't going to solve everything, but that's like number one is you got to stop going, mommy, 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 what do I do? What do I do? Help me, mommy, right? If that's your subliminal messaging to her, that's not going to do anything good for your marriage. So that's a fun little kind of like test to be like, ooh, wait, am I doing that? And then I love the way you kind of talked about it too, is addressing difficult conversations. This is like where kind of guys can get to their like 2.0 version, is you actually have these harder conversations without energy, without getting pissy or frustrated. She shot you down for sex, right? Are you going to go pout now? Well, no, you should go on your happy-go-lucky way and then be like, hey, honey, I just want you to understand like why this is problematic for me, And then your example is perfect. What a great way to kind of have that conversation. But I'll kick it over to Brandon here. I'm sure he has a ton to follow up on based off of that conversation. But the shopping cart test, guys, go do that one.
Yeah, well, I agree that the emotional regulation, like you have got to be able to check yourself with your emotions, because if you're going to go to your wife who's emotionally driven and be emotional with her, you're driving yourself off a cliff, man. Like it's just you're setting yourself up for failure. You have to be the person who has the calmness and that doesn't take everything so personal. Like if anybody gives you criticism and you're taking it on a personal level, you're that's where a lot of your emotions are going to trigger from, right? And so if you can place yourself outside of that and say, okay, what is she trying to convey to me, and how can I be intentional about getting better at this, right? So a good thing, like you had mentioned before, does she feel safe? Well, how do you protect your wife? Like one of the things I do, I'd say probably once a quarter, is I go down and I list all the ways in which I'm intentional with her mind and her heart. And so when she's not feeling safe, like I immediately know, because I know her facial expressions, I know her body language. She'll come home, I can immediately tell she's had a bad day. So how do I protect her? Well, I don't tell her anything. I don't ask her if she wants anything. I immediately go drop a bath. I get her favorite little chocolates and a drink, and I tell her, I've got the kids. Go soak for like 30 minutes, right? Just go have some me time, right? And I encourage that self-care, and that's how you protect her. You have to be intentional in protecting her, and you have to be intentional with like how you love her. And how do you love her? Well, you show her through your acts of service and through just doing things without having to be told. Like when I go grab a glass of water for myself, my wife is my one flesh, so I grab a glass of water for her too, right? And so I'd love to hear maybe some tricks and tips that you have and ways that you would protect your wife in your marriage, because maybe the guys might need to hear it there.
I don't know, man. I think you're the Jedi on this one after hearing all that. um, but I love that question, and I think perhaps this answer might help the guys out there. So, I love the theme of like just taking action, right? And then going back to George, what you were saying too is like if you're asking all these questions, it's just she's basically looking at you like a man child, and it's just something else she has to manage, right? What she really wants is a man to lead her, right? I use this comparison quite a bit. Do you guys watch Yellowstone?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the most attractive male figures for a woman in that show is Rip. And that's because he's very steady, unless you piss him off. But like he's very steady with Beth, and what I mean by that is he's dangerous, but he's also loving. He leads her, but he can also follow when needed. And when she's going through like her emotional craziness, he doesn't match that. In fact, he doesn't even really jump in the pool with her. He just stands. He just loves her steadily, right? But he doesn't.
Best clip is when he goes, "I don't have the energy for you today," and just walks away.
He goes, yeah. He's like, Beth, I'm not jumping in the crazy pool today, but I'll talk to you, right? Stuff like that. But for my wife, she'll tell you right away, I am not a bath person. Please don't run me a bath, right? So I think it's individualistic for women, but I think it's exactly what you're talking about, Brandon, which is always being observant of, if I'm getting a glass of water, I'll get my wife a glass of water. I won't be like, do you want a glass of water? If she doesn't want it, then she'll just let it sit there. That's fine. Like I want her to know I did my part here. And I'm, by the way, here's the other thing too. When you do these things, you do them without agenda.
Yep.
Without agenda.
Absolutely.
You do it because you love her, right?
Absolutely.
Not because you want something. Because women will sniff that a mile away, and that's repulsive, right? Because they're like, oh, you're doing the dishes because you want some action, right? Or you're, and that's not leading, I don't think, your woman well. Mm-hmm. But I think what you can do is really understand what moves the needle in your wife's life, right? Because the thing is number one, just know she probably won't ask for help. And if she does get to that point where she's asking you for help, you probably aren't helping enough. And if she's having to ask you for help, she feels guilty about asking you for help because she probably feels the pressure that she should be doing it all, but that's also wearing her out. So it's really being like, we call it being an observant ninja, right? How can we be observant? How can we be even cognitive of my wife's mental load, right? So like I'll give you another example of this, and we just learned this from a genius podcast guest who talks about what he calls cognitive mental load and invisible labor. His name is Zach Watson. You guys should really interview him. He's great. But he talks about like, and I didn't even realize, guys, how often I did this, and maybe y'all want to check yourselves real quick, see how often you do this, because it wasn't even on my radar. Anytime, like, if I need the mustard, or where are the pretzels, or where is that, like, I don't even look for it. Hey, Jess, do you know what this is? Hey, Mom, do you know what this is? Hey, Mom, have you seen this? Hey, Mom. Like, it's almost like Jessica is the manager of everything in this house.
Yeah.
So
that's
like,
the shopping cart principle right there.
Yeah, it's a shopping cart.
Yeah.
But I'm like, okay, like, look, I'm going to go look for this thing because, number one, I'm a fully functional adult, and I teach my kids the same thing now, too, because, like, perfect example of this is my 11-year-old was on antibiotics. He had an ear infection. And we went to, he's like, hey, I was putting him in bed. He's like, hey, I didn't get my antibiotics today. I was like, oh, well, let's go get it. We go in the fridge where it always is. It's not there. And he's like, let's just ask Mom. I was like, we are not asking Mom where it is. I was like, we will tear this kitchen and this fridge apart, and we're going to go to the other fridge too before we ask. So we tore the whole thing apart, and the whole time he's like, let's just ask Mom. I'm like, no. Leave no stone unturned until we completely have, we don't know where it's at. We look for this thing for like 10 minutes. Refrigerators all over the kitchen, and this is how I went to my wife. I didn't say, hey, do you know where Lawson's antibiotic is? You have to actually ask like this. Hey, I hate to ask, but I've looked everywhere. I've looked in the fridge. I've looked on the top shelf, the middle shelf, everywhere. I went in the mudroom fridge. I looked in there. I thought maybe it might be in the cabinet because it might be accidentally put in there. We've looked everywhere, and we don't know where it's at. Do you by any chance know where the antibiotic is? And she's like, oh, yeah, his last dose was this morning. I threw it away. I was like, okay. She's like, but I really appreciate you guys looking. So I think even that aspect of like, your wife is not your point person or the family's point person for all information needed at all times. Like, go and do these things like effectively as you possibly can, or go be independent and take that load off of her, because I will tell you, man, that cognitive mental load, that invisible labor like that, it is exhausting to them.
Yeah, and I think that separates leadership in a lot of work environments as well, because you have the guy that's constantly doubting himself and asking questions and overloading his superior when all he can do is just go and be his own independent person and just make executive decisions. Like, that's the guy that's going to grow over the person constantly, having to reassure and check. So I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, it's called decision fatigue. There's also compassion fatigue. I mean, there's all these kind of versions of kind of mental and emotional fatigues. And so, yeah, like, there's a great quote actually from one of my friends and mentors, John Michael Clark. He said, stop asking your wife to teach you how to be a husband. And so all these little things where it's like, mommy this, mommy that, mommy, 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 you're basically communicating to her, I don't know how to be your husband. I don't know how to lead you. And then, guys do that for like a decade or 15 years or 20 years, and then they can't understand why they have a sexless marriage. And it's like, dude, you haven't, given her the bare minimum basics that she craves as a woman for a decade or longer. There ain't no way, she's welling up within to be like, ooh, I want my husband, right? It's not how fit you are necessarily. It's not how much money you make. It's some of these very basic things that I think we've lost as a society. We stopped teaching young boys how to do this, and so then they get married and they have no idea what to do now. And, ironically, too, I talk about this stuff a lot. The only detractors I've really gotten are other men. Most women are like, yes, more of that, please, like in the comments and everything. And I was expecting to get a lot of hate from like feminists and stuff. And even, like every now and then there's like one, but for every one feminist, there's like 100 women that will comment and like, yeah, that's exactly right, So, most women, even if they're kind of a boss babe, if they're married to you, they want you to be the husband. That's why they married you. And in the same way, I flip it back on the guys of, if you talk to her like a bro or you talk to her like a man and try and logic her to death, guess what you're going to get in return? A masculine wife. That's not what you want. You married a woman. You were attracted to her because she was feminine and all the things feminine, right? So stop conditioning her to become more like you. Make her more of a woman and you become more of a man, and then watch your relationship just transform. And to your point earlier, Larry, that is the best possible way to train your children for success in their own future relationships. Model being a good husband. Your wife models being a good wife. whether you have sons or daughters, that is absolutely the way to do it. So on the flip side of what you talked about, Larry, with your boys, I'm a girl dad. So I'm modeling for her the type of man she should expect, the type of standards she should hold. And then my wife, we'll have some of the more intimate conversations about the feminine side of things, of course. But we both have that responsibility to do both jobs really well. And yeah, that, if you're a parent, congratulations. You signed yourself up for that voluntarily by having kids. So you got to live it now. Great stuff, man. I want to transition real quick before we run out of time. We love to ask a few kind of fatherhood really focused questions to all our guests. And I'll kick it off with the first one is, if you could rewind time back to when you had your firstborn, you're scared new dad thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not prepared for this. Knowing everything you know now, what would be the most important piece of advice you'd give your former self?
The first 3 months are going to suck. No, I mean, all kidding aside, the first 3 months are hard, but I think if I could give myself any advice, it would be this: stop overthinking it and just learn. Well, first of all, there's a couple pieces of advice. Don't overthink it, because that will steal your joy. You're overthinking about it, you're worrying about it, right? And no amount of worry is going to help you be a better father. In fact, it's going to just steal your joy right out from under you, and you're like, holy crap, where'd the time go? Did I even enjoy it? No, I was actually worried the whole time. So don't do that to yourself. The other thing, too, is this. Fatherhood, and you guys know this, I don't have to tell you this, fatherhood is like, and being married is just like anything else that anybody ever gets good at. It's a skill. You have to learn it. Like, I'm not kidding. You were in the Army, right, George?
Sorry, I was coughing. I missed what you said.
You were in the Army?
I was, yes.
Okay, so I want you to take this for what it's worth. Let's just say you show up for basic training. You've never been in the Army. I want you to go back to that time. You're like, hey, man, congratulations. Like, you're here for basic training. We just made a decision yesterday. There is no more basic training. Here's your uniform. Here's your firearm, and tomorrow we're deploying you to Afghanistan in a war zone. But don't worry. You've seen Rambo, right? You've seen Commando. You'll be fine. Best time of your whole life. You'll figure it out. You know how to shoot a gun, right? You'd be like, what the heck did I just sign up for?
Right.
Or you get a job. Like, let's just say, like one of my oldest son right now, he wants to get a job at Valvoline for right now because he wants to learn how to fix cars. And I'm like, yeah, man, do that. I was like, they'll train you to do that. But can you imagine showing up to your job, be like, well, you drive a car, so clearly you probably know how to change oil, right? You're good, right?
Yeah.
No. But here's the thing. Fatherhood, being a parent and getting married, people just pat you on the back. You'll figure it out, man. Best time of your whole life.
Yep.
And I'm like, that's crazy to me now at this point. Like
right.
That's how you're going to go about this. So like, I think be okay with being a student of it. Be like, hey, how can I learn the most I possibly can to do this husband thing right, to do this father thing right? I am not going to wing it. Like, if I could give myself any advice, do not. I winged it for 6 years. It was the most miserable 6 years of my fatherhood journey and marriage, was winging it.
Yeah.
So learn. That would be my advice.
Well, and two, like, that's why, you'll hire a coach or consultant for basically everything except being a better man, husband, and father. And it's like, of all the things I can invest my money and energy into, that's got to be the number one return on investment is with that. Like, I found that for myself, and it's kind of crazy that we, as a society, almost poo-poo that. What, you need a coach to be a man? It's like, well, no, okay, if you're going to attack it like that, it's more like, no, how do I be a much better husband and father, right? Like, that's a worthwhile thing to pursue over knowing every stat about the football team or your favorite beer selection. Like, which is worth your energy. So I love that, man.
Can I say something just really quick on that? Because I think
Absolutely.
I know you guys have a coaching platform, so do we. 2021, I literally, right before I had this podcast recording, I had coffee with one of our members. He actually lives one subdivision over from me. This guy joined our group in 2021. He left after 2 months. And I was like, I seen this guy in the gym, and I messaged him. I'm like, you're quitting? He came in for marriage, and he's like, yeah. He's like, hey, I really don't have time for this. He's like, and we're good. Me and my wife are good. Like, no worries. Like, and I'm like, and I knew he wasn't in a good place with his marriage. I'm like, listen, man, I've seen this happen. Don't let your foot off the gas. I'm encouraging you not to let your foot off the gas on this. Like, don't do this. And he's like, no, man, we got it. He's like, this is not for me. I'm like, okay. 3 months ago, I get a message, a panic 911. Hey man, I need to join the group again. My wife wants to split up. And I was in a very fiery mood that day. And I'm like, I told you, man. I told you this. Like, I told you this was going to happen. And you would not listen. Like, you wouldn't listen. You were just like, no, I don't have time for it. I don't have this. I don't have that. And now your marriage is on the brink of disaster. Now you want to do this stuff? And I gave this guy actually I never do this, but I gave this guy a hard time because I knew him. And I'm like, you know what? No. Because you're going to get in here for 2 months and you're not going to do the work. I know you won't. He's like, you quit once, you'll quit again. He's like, dude, I swear to God, I am in it this time. Like, I am in it. Like, this guy was telling me how bad he needed to join. And I was like, all right, if you are willing to work, show up and do this, then join. I was like, if you're not, if there's any inkling in you that you're not going to show up, don't do it. Don't waste anybody's time. Dude, this guy came in with his freaking hair on fire. He has shown up to everything. I just had coffee with him. He's like, I never thought I could actually turn my marriage around, but here I am 3 months later. He's like, but it's been so much work. I had no idea how. I was like, but you've learned, right? You've learned. He's like, oh, I've learned this skill and this skill and this skill. Holy crap. I could have saved myself 3 years of a disaster. So anyway, I agree with you. I encourage guys, like, it's really okay to sidestep your ego and be like, I don't have all the answers here. Can somebody help me? That's like one of the strongest things you can do.
Well, and the best time to invest in that, the best time to become better and greater, or whatever you want to call it, is not when you're in crisis mode. Right. If you're like, yeah, our marriage is like a 7 or 8, perfect. That is the best possible time to level up to 100, right? But if you're in crisis mode, you're barely going to get to level 10. You know what I mean? Because there's so many things you got to fix now. So it's like, it's this weird lie we've bought into that, well, if everything's fine, I don't need to improve it. And it's like, oh man, if it's just fine, that's just like one bad thing away from utter disaster. You know, I'd rather be climbing the mountain and stumble down a little bit and still be near the summit. Right. That's just me, man. You know, not for everyone maybe, but I love that you drove that home, man. It's real good.
So I have an analogy for this, and it's called the rowboat fallacy.
Okay.
So if your marriage has a problem, that's a hole in the boat. And yeah, it's not going to sink you today, but over time it's going to sink entirely. And all you have to do is put the work in to plug it. But if you ignore it, and then all of a sudden you're panicking when the water's up to the top of it and you're sinking, buddy, it's too late. You know, you have to plug the holes, and you have to do preventative maintenance, just like a car. Your marriage has to have it too. You know, if you had a Ferrari of a woman, which most of us do because we love our women and that's why we chose them, are you going to just run it 10,000 miles without an oil change? No. So what does that look like maintenance-wise? Well, that looks like at least 90 minutes a week of talking one-on-one with your wife. Some recreational things to do together, you know, intimacy, both emotionally and physically, because she needs the emotional side. But plug the hole. And it sounds like that guy just saw the holes like, oh, it's fine. It'll ride for a little while. It's like, no, man, plug it right now. It's so dangerous. So I agree. The growth mindset is one of the most valuable tools a man can have in his arsenal when he is doing anything intentional in his life, whether it's his career, his wife, his children. So yeah, growth mindset, super, super important. And it builds legacy, right? And that actually leads to my question for you, which is, what legacy do you hope to leave for future generation of fathers through your work with the Dad Edge? Because, you know, you've been at this for about 10 years more than we have, and I can say that you've probably got a substantial bigger view than we do on this.
Well, thank you for the question, man. And I'll tell you this, the vision for Dad Edge has changed. And that is, what I mean by that is we used to really encourage men to be like, hey, learn this stuff. Be the best version of you, right? Learn this stuff. Not so much anymore. Yes, that. Still that. But don't be a pond. Be a river to your kids. And what I mean by that is you're learning, I'm not sure what you guys teach in your group coaching environment. I'm sure it's gold, right? In fact, I'm sure it's probably pretty similar. But our message to our guys is, do not be a pond, be a river. teach your kids what we're teaching you. Teach them all these dynamics of healthy relationships. Teach them all these dynamics that we teach around communication. Teach them by being the example of the things of your own standards in your life, and bring them into your world. Go into their world, right? All the time.
Oh, yeah.
But also bring them into your world of these things that you're trying to teach them. Just really tiny, quick example here. My wife and I got in an argument, and I was dead wrong. Like I was definitely the wrong one. And one thing that my kids don't see a whole lot of in our house is conflict resolution, because my wife and I hardly ever argue. So my oldest son, and I knew I was going to get my butt kind of handed to me, even though my wife is never disrespectful, even if it's like, hey, she's called me forward on something. But I went to my son and I said, hey, I'm going to go apologize. We were in the other room. I go, I'm going to go apologize to your mom right now. And I want you to sit on the couch just like you have been. And I want you to sit there acting like you're doing your homework. But I want you to have your eyes and ears on. And I just want you to be a fly on the wall listening to this conversation, so you know what conflict resolution looks like.
That's good.
And I went to my wife and I apologized for what I said and did. And after she gave me some feedback, which was very respectful, I was like, holy crap, I really let my son in on a doozy here. Like, I'm just like, wow, like this one's pretty bad. But he listened to all of it, and he listened to how we resolved it. And it didn't, it wasn't me pleading for forgiveness or anything like that. Right. It was two adults having a conversation around conflict resolution, but he did hear my wife like call out some really gnarly things that I did. And I went to my son and I was like, what'd you think of that? He's like, whoa. He's like, that was crazy. Like, how did you keep your cool when she was telling you that stuff? I was like, 'cause it was true. I was like, all of it was true. Like, what leg did I have to stand on? Everything she said was absolutely dead on. I was like, but she said it in a very respectful, loving way, didn't she? He's like, yeah, she did. And I was like, how did I receive it? He goes, very respectfully. I was like, that's conflict resolution.
Yep.
I was like, so I think it's really important. Like, don't just tell your kids all this stuff. Like, actually show them, like, when it's even uncomfortable, right?
Oh, yeah. That's so good, man. I love that. All right, Larry, where's the best place for people to find you and support you and check out the podcast and everything?
Just thedadedge.com. Like,
all right.
I always tell people, if you have no clue what we do, just start with the podcast. We've got 1,300 episodes to keep you busy for the next 10 years.
We just hit 100. We were proud about that. Now I feel pretty small now.
More to go.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's awesome, man. Yeah. Well, any last thoughts or just things you want to share before we wrap this one up, brother?
No, here's my last thoughts. I just want to share with your audience, like, I don't know you guys that well, but man, like the few minutes before we got to know each other, like you guys, like for you guys in the audience here listening to these two men, we prayed before this podcast, which I thought was fascinating. Like these men that you guys follow right here, George and Brandon, like these guys' hearts are in the right place, guys. Like, follow these guys, enter into their coaching environment. Like, these guys know what they're doing, and they do it from such a good place. And at the very least, though, share their show. Please leave them a 5-star review. These guys absolutely deserve it. They're pouring their hearts out for you guys. So that's my final thoughts.
Dude, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And, we said it before we started. It's just so great to connect with other men, like-minded, trying to make a real impact in multiple families, right? By helping men, we help their families. And, I think our country has sorely needed that for a long time. And it's good to see more of it happening. And I know you've been at it for a decade, so it's not like you're the newcomer, but it's just good to connect with you. And, of course, we're going to continue to support you moving forward. And guys, check out Larry. Go follow all his stuff if you haven't already, and give him a look over as well. So, Larry, thank you so much, man. Let's get out there, dads. Let's get climbing that mountain of fatherhood. We'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching this episode of the podcast. If you're on YouTube, drop a subscription to us. And if you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave us a review. It helps greatly. If you are also ready to level up as a man, check out Elite Sentinel Coaching, our program designed specifically for men, where we forge men into leaders. We turn cowards into kings, weaklings into warriors. Become the hero in your story. Join us today.